Doctors of Reddit. What was your how the fuck did you survive that moment? I was working in the emergency department when a toddler came in after falling out of a 3-story window completely unharmed. The sad thing was they were from a rough neighborhood and the mum hadn't noticed for about half an hour. Apparently, the friendly apartment pot smokers found him, checked him over and sat with him for half an hour, and when mum didn't show up went to find her. The child was admitted overnight mostly for social reasons, but it's just amazing how well kids bounce. When I was small, around 4 or 5 maybe, don't remember the date, I got hit by 3 different cars in the span of 1 hour. I wanted to sit with my mom on the front seat and ran to the street from the back seat, got hit by a car and was sent flying by about 20 meters and hit a metal pole. I got up, tried to walk over to my family and got hit by another car. It was near an intersection and the car was driving pretty fast, so they didn't see the accident. At this point in time my family was freaking out and all I remember is my mom going to the hospital with me and the rest is blank until after I leave the hospital, I was fine. After I got out of the hospital I decided to run for some fucking reason and got hit by another car. I had a concussion and a nosebleed from this ordeal but completely fine in every other way. Edit, for anyone wondering. I live in Mongolia and this happened over a decade ago and I am now completely fine. I remember some odd details about the day of the accident, like what time of the day it was, around noon, because we were going to celebrate my mom's birthday, but can't remember other finer details like what year it was since it really didn't matter to me. You can doubt it or call it fake, but it won't really change anything, so you can do it as much as you like. Just thought I would share a story of my retarded younger days that always gets a chuckle out of me when I remember it. With that being said, I'ma show myself out cause I have unit to attend to. Intern year doing surgery, guy gets brought in for a gunshot wound to the head. He was working at a jeweler that got robbed, his coworker was black-bagged at the scene. He gets brought into the trauma bay and it's pretty hectic because GSW to the head and well he's alive. Not only is he alive, he's following commands but not speaking, probably from the shock. Cops are giving us reports saying he was likely shot with a .357 snub nose they recovered at the scene. So, we do our primary and secondary survey and all this guy has is a single wound to his left frontal scalp where the bullet went in. So the team hasn't really seen something like this before. Sure, a GSW to the head wasn't new, but this guy was otherwise completely fine. The decision was made to get a quick frontal and late head X-ray to verify where the bullet was before proceeding to court. Well, we don't see any bullet on the films, there's no bullet on the board or bed or within the patient's clothes. The man was shot in the head and the bullet bounced off his skull. CT showed no fracture even. It was wild, never seen anything like that since. So, a common question I'm getting is how do we know it was a GSW? He had gunpowder burns on his forehead around the wound. I was a surgical resident in a small town hospital. We got paged to see a patient for a speared piece of driftwood through the leg. We were thinking it was a nicked femoral artery and discussing if this poor kid needed amputation when we saw him. He was standing on the skewered leg taking a piss. Turns out the wood missed every single one of the vital vessels and no fracture, just muscular damage. Every time I think this question, the answer is usually meth. One guy got hit in the face hard enough to let air into his brain cavity and was being an absolute arsehole, which seemed to be normal for him, and literally asked, "Got any meth?" when I offered some pain relief. To my understanding, he recovered without any need for surgery. Not a doctor yet, but I worked in a trauma center as a scribe before starting med school. Basically, I was attached at the hip with a doctor to do their documentation. One guy wrecked his car into a wooden fence, and a wooden fence post went in his mouth and came out the back of his neck. It was the kind of fence post that was double the size of his mouth. It had basically pushed all of the important anatomy to the side as it impaled him. There were consulting doctors for like 10 different specialties working on this guy in the hospital. Several weeks later, after he fully recovered, he walked back in the emergency department to thank everyone. Emergency nurse. Once had a guy come in who had been cutting a tree with a chainsaw when it hit a knot in the wood and kicked up into his neck. Finished cutting the tree because he knew his wife would make him get rid of the chainsaw. Put a towel on it and drove himself to the hospital. CT showed no vascular damage, simple washout and home the next day. One of the paramedics who saw him said to his patient, "That's a real emergency, why don't we ever get those?" Edit, location Australia, Queensland. Not a doctor. My dad who is one told me this story once. He has this 12-year-old patient, let's call him Tim, and everyone in the hospital firmly believes he's immortal. Tim was born with a bad heart and is constantly in and out of the ICU. By in and out of the ICU, he goes in almost once or twice a month. 9 out of 10 admissions, Tim flatlines. Strangely, Tim always comes back even if you don't resuscitate him. I'd say Tim flatlined about 15-ish times in total. It's at the point that whenever Tim flatlines, nobody panics. Not even his mom, and the first 3 times she fell on the floor crying. "Hey guys, Tim's vitals are dropping, again, that kid's definitely going for a record." Tim's pretty chill about it too. He talks about his ICU trips like how a normal kid talks about a mildly eventful day at school. Nobody knows how TF does Tim always come back. He just does. Frankly, I'm surprised the media hasn't done a story about it because it's fucking metal. First year of my core surgical training, I was on call in a very small rural hospital. This hospital only had 2 doctors on at night, me and a medical trainee, and no emergency doctors. It's about 11 p.m. and this guy, 26, comes in after being in a fight. Blood pumping from his nose, which was clearly fractured. I suspected he probably had other facial fractures underneath, but he was awake and talking to me, otherwise seemed fine. I spent about 45 minutes trying to stop the blood, using all sorts of nose packs, pressure, even tried a catheter balloon to try and tamponade it. Nothing was working, and he was starting to go into shock, and I was basically shitting myself at this stage. Based on his vitals, I'd estimated he'd lost almost 1.5 liters of blood so far. Nearest proper surgical hospital was 45 minutes away, and my consultant was at home, 25 minutes from the hospital. Eventually I got 4 bags of O-neg from the lab. The lab tech happened to be in, which was very lucky, put this guy in the back of an ambulance, still bleeding, and sent him blue light to the surgical center in the city. Got a phone call about 3 hours later from a surgeon at the other hospital, saying he had brought the patient to theater and been able to control the situation. He was probably 15 minutes from dead. If you come into that kind of small hospital with that much bleeding, all stats say you're in trouble. The guy was very lucky his friends got him in so quickly. Not a doctor but paramedic. Once went a car wreck where a drunk drove headfirst into the corner of a brick bridge at 100 miles per hour. Took a huge wedge out of the bottom of the bridge and left the car about 1/4 of its normal length. All the impact was on the driver's side. Turned up only 2 minutes after the crash and fully expected it to be a fatality. Walked round to the driver's side and somehow he was fully conscious but squeezed into the only space left in the car. Took almost 3 hours to get him out, and on extracting him out he had absolutely nothing wrong with him other than being a pissed up asshole. Still think how the fuck did he survive that? Not a doctor yet, but during one of my night shift as a medical student, I had to take in charge a patient who came to the ER for a car accident. Well, that's quite common. What is not is that he came by himself, from 40 km, by calling a taxi because his car was absolutely wrecked in the accident. Normally, when your car ends up upside down, after 2 or 3 rollovers at 60 km per hour, which the patient did, you are not really fine. However, he was totally okay. No broken bone, no head trauma, no abdominal pain, nothing. He just came to the ER because he had little dermabrasions over his knees and 1 elbow, and "it hurts when it rubs against my clothes." 3 band-aids later, and he was good to go. Junior doc on the trauma team. Doors to Resus fly open to reveal a man carrying a second blood-soaked man in his arms. Get him onto a stretcher and it is clear he has gunshot wound to his chest and has gone into cardiac arrest, asystole. Chest compressions start and within minutes the A&E consultant is performing an open thoracotomy in order to start cardiac massage. Cardiothoracic join us quickly and get to work on the heart. A hole in the right ventricle is identified and plugged with a Foley catheter. All the while bag after bag of O-neg is being pushed into the patient in an attempt to replace everything that had pumped out of his heart and into his thoracic cavity. 15 to 20 minutes into this the impossible happens, we get ROSC, the heart starts beating in its own. Patient is taken directly to theater where the hole is definitively repaired and bilateral chest drains are inserted to drain the blood filling his lungs, technically the pleural space. Somehow his heart continued beating, and after a couple weeks on ITU, the patient is returned to the trauma ward awake and alert. Several weeks, some mild hypoxic brain injury, and a gnarly chest scar later, and he walks off the ward with his dad, the man who carried him in. ETA definition of ROSC. Not a doctor, but a friend's story. He'd been feeling like shit for a long time, went to the doctor. Doctor ordered a bunch of blood tests, and ordered them on a rush basis. The lab calls the doctor to bitch him out. Why the fuck did you make us rush these tests? Doctor is confused. Lab is like, the guy is clearly dead, so what's the fucking rush? Doctor calls him, tells him to not drive but to get himself to emergency ASAP. Guy was a type 1 diabetic, hadn't realized it until way later in life, and apparently his blood work suggested he was a corpse rather than a living person. He's still doing fine. Patient, not as cool as most of these, but I was puking for 3 days straight before going into urgent care. I wasn't even going to go in, but my family said I looked awful and I eventually relented. They said I had appendicitis. Due to a mix-up I didn't get operated on for over a day later. When they went in, my appendix was gangrenous and had basically disintegrated. Turns out it had ruptured days ago. Normally, this floods your body with toxins and you die, but apparently my colon was positioned in such a way that it blocked that from happening. I was in the hospital for another week before my digestive system restarted and had to have bile pumped out of my stomach. All in all though, not a terrible experience.